Nintendo Software Technology, a long-running studio set up in 1998 as one of Nintendo's very few Western-owned studios, alongside Retro Studios and Next Level Games. They are well known for developing many fondly remembered titles, including 1080 Avalanche, Pokemon Puzzle League, Waverace Blue Storm, numerous entries in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, and possibly their best-known hit, Metroid Prime Hunters. Around 2006, with the full reveal of the Wii, NST's new game was announced, an original game known as Project H.A.M.M.E.R that would serve as a hardcore Western developed game for Western audiences by a Western studio. However, this game never came to be, and the company was soon mainly just working on Mario vs. Donkey Kong games and eventually just in charge of porting games. What happened to this acclaimed Western branch, and how did Nintendo let it happen? Today on Gaming History, we shall look at how Nintendo ruined its Western studio. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. In the late 90s, Nintendo wasn't doing too hotly in the console market, being treated as more a child's console and not very much appealing to Westerners as they once did, losing out badly to the more popular PlayStation console. Nintendo during this period decided that it needed a bigger Western presence to make games that could appeal to Westerners. On the one hand, Nintendo made a new Texas-based company known as Retro Studios in collaboration with the infamous Jeff Spangenberg. On the other hand, through a collaboration with DigiPen Institute of Technology, right in Nintendo of America's headquarters in Redmond, Washington, they made Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short. As such, the studio took on many recent graduates and doctorate-level instructors from the university. Much like the other Western studio, NST was now ready to develop Western-focused games. For their first game, they were tasked to make a new entry to the Bionic Commando series, a series owned by Capcom, but a series that definitely had a more Western flavor to it, featuring a run-and-gun action platformer gameplay in a more military fashion. It may have been just a Game Boy Color game, but it was a start in showcasing the perspective NST was taking in contrast to their Japanese counterparts. Following this was Ridge Racer 64, again being a third-party game handed over for them to tackle, with racing games being popular with Westerners, especially Ridge Racer on the PlayStation 1. This was another good match, and their first test with a three-dimensional game too, with that being followed by a reimagining of the game Chrysalis, coming for the Game Boy. Following these, they finally were given the key to work on Nintendo's first-party series, most popularly Pokemon Puzzle League, but as well Waverace Blue Storm and 1080 Avalanche. It was clear the studio was gaining a good deal of experience in developing games in full, including sequels to Nintendo's own franchises, and give them that Western touch that the East would have a tougher time with. This was to the extent that Metroid Prime's producer, Kensuke Tanabe, even contacted NST to make a Metroid Prime midquel on the new Nintendo DS. While Retro Studios was busy with Metroid Prime 2, Tanabe saw NST as the best fit as to give the series an even bigger Western touch with this game, and the game did just that. While Metroid Prime was an excellent adaptation of the Metroidvania style into 3D, NST took that and made it into a full-blown first-person shooter, down to even developing a beloved online multiplayer mode that was very comparable with many other shooters and their multiplayer modes too. And so Metroid Prime Hunters became NST's most defining game yet, a series that was developed by Westerners but now focused even more with that Western perspective while still being a solid game. At that point, around 2003, the studio was definitely steady and focused. After taking on a combination of first and third-party games, the studio was now looking to build an original game for Nintendo's new console, the Wii, called Project H.A.M.M.E.R. The Wii was Nintendo's new plan as it developed it through the early 2000s. Nintendo during the GameCube days still was unable to shake off that kiddie stigma and still didn't have enough to appeal to Westerners. While Retro Studios and NST did exist, the series they worked on hadn't made a dent in bringing more hardcore Western games to the GameCube. And so in 2003, with the Wii in the middle of development, instead of trying to westernize existing properties, they were instead trying to make an original game that would appeal to the West and the hardcore crowd. The game was codenamed Machine X, and unlike Nintendo's usual titles, this was meant to be brutal and gritty. While working on this game, the studio was still handling other projects too, including first-party and third-party games, such as another entry for Ridge Racer, now on the DS, and a sequel to Donkey Kong 94 called Mario vs. Donkey Kong. By 2006, the Wii had its full showcase at E3, and amongst its many games included Super Mario Galaxy, Metroid Prime 3, and Zelda Twilight Princess. But also one Western-developed game was shown by Nintendo, which was a totally new IP. The game was titled as Project H.A.M.M.E.R, formerly known as Machine X. The game looked to be set in a contemporary world with fully muted colors and in a full lockdown considering the barricades. The protagonist wielded, much as the title suggests, a giant hammer to fight off what appears to be an army of robots, utilizing what appears to be motion controls of the Wii. If one game was set to be a game that looked truly gritty and Western by Nintendo, this was it. Now, while Nintendo's Western studios were mostly working independently on their projects, they were however closely monitored too. Retro Studios, for example, had Nintendo, or rather specifically Shigeru Miyamoto, step in several times during development of Metroid Prime to put in suggestions such as the switch to first person. This was also to be the case with NST. Through much of the first 3 years of development, a great deal of the game's budget was spent on the cutscenes developed by an external studio called Silver Ant early in development, and as a result, development started to fall behind, but eventually has started to pace towards even being close to complete. Nintendo's Japanese headquarters themselves start to closely inspect the project. Several faults were there. Other than the exorbitant amount of money spent, the gameplay was apparently not fun. It was more or less following what was a Muso-style gameplay as the July 2020 Giga Leak had revealed to us. But being that the controls were to swing the hammer with the Wiimote's motion controls, it wasn't very good. With all that was going on with this game, Nintendo's executives in Japan felt it was time to rebrand the title away from its Western perspective and to a more cutesy look, and capitalize on it much as they did with other Wii titles such as Wii Sports. Thus, this game was now called Wii Crush. Gone were the days of the realistic and gritty design of the original game, and instead was basically an Eastern-style game with bright colors in its place. While it's not confirmed why this change was made, its overly simple controls with the hammer may have been perceived as being too simple for a hardcore game, and more suited for a casual game like this new Wii Crush game instead, with the objective now being more environmental damage over fighting actual enemies. However, there was outright resistance at NST over this decision. Staff threw a great deal of suggestions to Nintendo's executives in Japan, but were brushed off quickly and told that NST wouldn't understand because they weren't Japanese. Many as such felt that they were dealing with a great deal of racism from the very company that they had worked and grown with for so long. In fact, the Japanese senior staff simply had cultural issues with the game, despite it being initially made as a game for Western gamers. And so in droves, many employees started to leave NST. The very same staff that developed beloved titles such as Pokemon Puzzle League and Metroid Prime Hunters were gone. This being followed by the game's head designer being suddenly fired, with those same executives blaming him for the failures of the game instead of taking any blame themselves. Nintendo of America soon took notice of this massive departure and stepped in for an internal review. Taking a survey, the company's morale was at an all-time low after having the original project outright destroyed. And so, in 2009, after 5 grueling years on this game with very little staff remaining, Project H.A.M.M.E.R was formally cancelled by Nintendo. While a Western studio like Retro Studios rose to incredible heights and kept their major titles, NST had now become the opposite instead. With so many employees now gone, their ability to make major games had diminished too. Gone were the days when they could take on third-party titles such as Ridge Racer. Gone were the days when they could make successful entries in acclaimed first-party titles like Metroid Prime Hunters. The remaining developers, such as veteran NST engineer Yoon Jun Lee and designer Richard Verodi, did tried to salvage the company by pitching a new entry to the Waverace series for the Wii. They even came up with a robust control scheme with motion controls of the Wii to imitate the jet ski gameplay, even utilizing the Wii balance board. Nintendo of America was a fan of it and even did a patent for it. And so after 3 months of working on a prototype, it was presented to Nintendo HQ in Japan. While it did garner interest, it was ultimately rejected. Apparently, while a robust motion control scheme was developed, Nintendo just didn't feel it was right, and so it was rejected. With that, Nintendo HQ didn't trust them anymore with AAA titles after how much money they had spent for 5 years and no game coming out of it. This being without putting any blame on themselves, especially now with how small the team had become, and so they were now just reduced to making more Mario and Donkey Kong games between 2004 and 2016, where they made 7. Even then, the development of those games soon came to a halt, as they were put more onto porting games instead, like Super Mario Maker for the 3DS, Captain Toad, and Super Mario 3D World. At most, they were given the opportunity to do minor development work with new or added content. As for other games, like Snipper Clips, The Stretchers, and Good Job, they were simply development support. While NST originally started out alongside Retro Studios as companies that could make a bigger impact for Nintendo in the West, this experiment had failed horrendously. Who was at fault here? Well, both sides realistically had many faults. On the one hand, NST went over budget on this game and had produced only a lackluster product. However, Nintendo HQ in Japan at the same time were too stubborn to try and further refine it into a good product, and instead tried to reimagine it in their own ways that killed morale, that ultimately led to this company being put out to rot. In fact, projects that would normally be expected for them to develop were now being given out to others instead. Metroid Prime Federation Force, for example, was instead given to Next Level Games, a now first-party Western studio for Nintendo in Vancouver, Canada to make. And it seems Nintendo does intend to, as of the creation of this video, let them rot, with their role further and further diminishing over time and just being there as a support team at the very most. And thank you for watching! Hit the subscribe button for more Nintendo and other games gaming history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on who you think was at fault. So everyone, thank you for watching.